We've been told for centuries that history is made by men. We like to think that the rise and fall of empires comes down to a brilliant tactical maneuver, a king's iron will, or a traitor's knife in the dark. It's a comforting thought, honestly. It gives us the illusion that we're in control, that our actions actually dictate the course of time. But every once in a while, the planet decides to remind us that we are nothing more than tenants on a very unstable piece of rock. We build these massive armies. We forge steel that can slice through bone, and we convince ourselves we're invincible. Then, nature just breathes, and in a single afternoon, everything we've built, the kings, the knights, the grand ambitions, is just gone. I want you to picture an army, not just any army, but the absolute peak of 13th century military might. We're talking about 1,000 knights, the heavy hitters of their era. These guys were basically the tanks of the Middle Ages. They spent their whole lives training for one thing: war. Their armor was state-of-the-art, a shimmering shell of steel and chainmail that made them feel like gods among men. They had the best horses, the sharpest lances, and the backing of an empire that thought it was destined to rule forever. They were marching toward a battle they were sure they would win. They were looking for an enemy they could see, someone they could stab, someone they could trample. But the enemy that was coming for them didn't have a face, and it didn't care about their titles or their bravery. The day started out normal, which is the scariest part of these stories. There's no warning siren from the earth. The first thing that went wrong wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A deep, sick vibration that you felt in your teeth, more than your ears. Imagine being one of those knights. You're sitting on a massive war horse, and suddenly, the animal starts losing its mind. These were horses trained to charge into a wall of spears without flinching, but now they're shying away from the very ground they're standing on. They can feel the tremors before the humans can. They know the earth is about to open up. Then came the smell. It wasn't the smell of a campfire or a forge. It was the thick, choking stench of sulfur, the smell of the deep earth, or as the men of that time believed, the smell of hell itself. In the 1200s, people didn't have a scientific explanation for tectonic plates or magma chambers. If the ground started shaking and the air turned to poison, you didn't think volcanic eruption. You thought the apocalypse. You thought God was finally done with you, and looking at that sky, you'd be hard-pressed to argue otherwise. The sun didn't just go down. It was extinguished. It turned this bruised, sickly purple color before the darkness hit. A darkness so thick, you could practically feel it against your skin. This wasn't the dark of night where your eyes eventually adjust. This was total, absolute sensory deprivation. And then the snow started falling. But it wasn't cold. It was searing hot, gritty, and black. It was ash falling in such massive quantities that it started to bury the world in real time. Now think about that armor. Those beautiful, expensive suits of steel. In a normal battle, they were a lifesaver. But in a volcanic fallout, they became a literal oven. The metal began to soak up the ambient heat of the air, which was rapidly climbing into the hundreds of degrees. The knights were being cooked inside the very thing meant to protect them. The ash wasn't just falling, it was getting into everything. It clogged the visors of their helmets, making it impossible to breathe. It got into the joints of their armor, grinding against the metal, until the knights couldn't even move their arms or legs. They were frozen in place, heavy statues of steel waiting to be buried alive. Panic is a funny thing. In a movie, everyone screams and runs in one direction. In reality, it's much more chaotic. In that pitch blackness, with the world screaming around them, those 1,000 knights weren't an army anymore. They were just 1,000 terrified individuals. Men were stumbling over their own horses, falling into ditches they couldn't see, and in some cases, drawing their swords and hacking at the shadows because they thought the demons had finally arrived. You have to understand the psychological horror of this. You're a warrior. You're supposed to die with a sword in your hand, but instead, You're choking on dust in the dark, unable to see your own hand in front of your face. And then there's the gas. This is the silent killer that people always forget about. When a volcano like this goes off, it releases massive clouds of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. These gases are heavier than air. They don't float away, they sink, they crawl along the ground like an invisible tide. The knights who tried to be smart and take cover in low-lying valleys or ravines were actually walking straight into a death trap. They didn't even realize they were dying. They just felt sleepy, sat down to rest for a second, and their hearts simply stopped because there was no oxygen left to breathe. Thousands of elite soldiers just expired without a single drop of blood being shed. When the sun finally tried to peek through the haze a few days later, the world was unrecognizable. Imagine the shock of the survivors, if there were any nearby. The green valleys, the roads, the villages, it was all gone. Everything was covered in a uniform, ghostly layer of gray ash. It looked like a different planet. And somewhere under that gray blanket were 1,000 of the finest warriors the Empire had ever produced. They weren't heroes anymore. They were just lumps in the landscape. This event didn't just kill an army. It broke the back of the Empire itself. When you lose your entire elite force in a single afternoon to a Hand of God event, you don't just go back to business as usual. The economy collapsed. The labor force was decimated. But more importantly, the myth of the Empire's invincibility was shattered. Neighbors who had been terrified of these knights suddenly realized that the heavens weren't on the Empire's side. It triggered a domino effect of invasions, revolts, and famines that lasted for decades. We see the skeletons today, or we read about them in dusty chronicles, and we think of it as history. We look at it as something that happened to them, those primitive people who didn't understand the world. But the truth is, we're not much better off. We have satellites and sensors, sure, but if the Earth decides to pull the rug out from under us today, our steel, our technology, our jets, our tanks, will be just as useless as those knights' armor. We are still at the mercy of a planet that is vastly more powerful than any weapon we've ever built. There's something incredibly humbling, and honestly a bit terrifying, about the idea of an army being erased. Defeated. Erased. It's the ultimate ego check for humanity. Those knights probably spent their last morning arguing over who had the best horse or who would win the most glory in the coming battle. They were so focused on the horizon, on their human enemies, that they never thought to look at the mountain behind them. They never thought that the ground itself would be their executioner. This story stays with you because it's a reminder that we live on a hair trigger. We spend our lives worrying about politics, money, and who's winning whatever war is going on at the moment. But we forget that we're sitting on a massive engine of heat and pressure that doesn't care about our borders. That army of 1,000 knights is a testament to that. They were the height of human power, and nature treated them like a nuisance to be swept away. Next time you see a mountain or a clear blue sky, don't take it for granted, because 1,000 guys who were much tougher than you or me once thought they were in charge of the world, right up until the moment the sky fell. They didn't leave behind a heroic story of a last stand or a glorious charge. They left behind silence, a layer of ash, and a lesson that we still haven't quite learned. In the fight between man and the Earth doesn't even have to try. The legacy of that day isn't found in a trophy room or a history book. It's found in the quiet gray ash that still sits in the soil of those valleys. It's a story of a battle that never happened, of an enemy that couldn't be fought, and of a power that makes our greatest empires look like children playing with sticks. Those knights are still there, in a way, locked in their steel coffins, a permanent part of the landscape they tried to conquer. And as we move forward into our own modern era, we should probably keep one eye on the horizon and the other on the ground beneath our feet. Because the sky can fall again, and when it does, it won't matter how much steel we're carrying.